I'm just not a Danny. I'm just not a Danny.
Oh, yeah, okay.
That's all. So, yeah, hello. Welcome to Post-Exertional Mayonnaise podcast. I'm Dan, and I'm joined by Becky Holmes today. Becky is a writer and Twitter aficionado from Stratford-upon-Avon in the UK. Becky lives with Emmy, and she's the author of Keanu Reeves is Not in Love with You, the murky world of online romance fraud. And just in case you want to see, that's the cover. And
what a marvellous cover it is too.
It's brilliant because it looks like there's an extra page behind, doesn't it? It's very clever the way it's brilliant design. I really like it. So yes, the murky world of online romance fraud. So we're going to kind of get into the book a little bit more later. But it'd be interesting kind of just to learn a bit more about yourself, Becky, and your sort of chronic illness journey. Do you want to tell us a bit about a bit about your journey with that, and kind of what did life look like before Emmy, and kind of what does it look like now, and what's that process been like for you?
Oh, like with most people, I think it's been absolutely life-changing. My life prior to Emmy looks nothing like it did now. Life now is okay, but there was a number of years where everything just fell apart. So prior to getting Emmy, I'm never quite sure of the right way, I was running a press office for a big financial services organisation. I had a team of people. I absolutely lived for my career. I loved it. I decided not to have a family because for me, I don't know, just everything was about my career. It wasn't a kind of, I've got to sacrifice something. It was that that's what I wanted. I wanted this career and I was loving it. I loved the people that worked for me. I loved the people that I worked for. And I was climbing the ranks. And then Emmy sort of hit me like a freight train in my mid-30s, early to mid-30s. And I had to give up my job. Now, giving up my job, it just sort of sounds like, so I had to give up work. It wasn't like that. It was, I had to give up my career. And with giving up my career, my everything in my future seemed to just disappear in front of me because it was everything that I'd ever wanted. As a result of that, my husband and I moved house. We could, the mortgage was too much for just one salary. We moved house. The whole marriage changed, the dynamic of it. So he wasn't a carer, didn't become a carer, but it wasn't a husband and wife relationship anymore, which made things very difficult. And ultimately, I made the decision to leave, mainly because he was a really good man. He worked very, very hard. And I always felt it was extremely unfair that he suddenly had this person that wasn't who he married. So I had a couple of disastrous relationships, but to cut a long story short, I ended up going from a 5-bed detached house with lots of land back into my childhood bedroom at my mum's house.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. And so I was probably about 40 by that point, and I just, I was feeling so poorly. People around me didn't understand at all. And I really felt genuinely rock bottom. No career, no partner, back in my mum's house. It just felt like I had no idea what was next.
Yeah. And then it's sort of trying to kind of like make sense of what's happened to your life suddenly, isn't it? It's like you sort of find yourself in this situation, you think, how did this happen? And like, even for me, because it's six years since I became ill as an adult, and I still sort of like wake up some mornings and think, oh, do I need to go to work today? And it suddenly sort of just like hits you, doesn't it, a bit? And it's like, and then it's like you're dealing with that kind of grief all over again. We're like, oh, hang on a minute, it's just, no, I'm not going to work. It's like,
it is absolutely grief. It's like a bereavement, isn't it? Because it's a bereavement of a life that you, for the most part, really enjoy, really love. And I think that the worst thing for me is I had people in my life who'd say, oh, well, I get tired. I know how you feel. And everybody listening to this will be thinking, oh, God, yes, I've heard that. But when it comes from people who are very close to you, I think there's a real hurt there. And I think one of the hardest things, and I'm sure you'll have spoken to everybody about this, is when something's invisible. It's that thing where my friends only see me when I'm well enough for them to see me.
Yeah.
So when I'm in my flat on my own, in bed, no one ever sees the true nature of the illness. But when you go out, I can go out for a couple of hours at a time and I can be the life and soul. And then I get home, put my pajamas on and get under a blanket. And we all have that mask, don't we, that we try desperately to put on, and we know that we're going to crash as a result of it. I've never been very good at the whole pacing thing. Never been very good at it. I've tried. I've often tried.
Yeah. It's the pacing. Yeah, we've just got an episode that I'm about to put out on the podcast that I did with Amy Arthur, who's written a book about pacing. So it'll be an interesting one. But it is always that challenge, isn't it, in terms of like how much you push yourself to have some sort of level of quality of life versus not pushing yourself at all and sort of staying within this energy envelope. But then how much is life worth living in terms of quality of life? It's that toss up, isn't it, in terms of how to find that balance.
Of late, because I've been doing quite a bit of media stuff because of what I've been doing recently, I've had to look at each engagement. So if I'm doing a speaking event, for example, and I have to weigh up, is it worth what's going to happen afterwards? And most of the time at the moment it is. So I make sure that I rest for a couple of days. I do an event that I enjoy, and then I make sure that I've got nothing to do for a while afterwards. So like a 2-hour speaking engagement takes kind of 4 days out of my week. But I honestly think that I would rather live this sort of life of having some really good bits and then paying for it than just maintaining a medium. I don't think that's for me.
And everybody's got a different way of kind of like processing or managing that, or some people kind of like stay quite sort of zen, don't they, in this kind of bubble, and it's not easy at all to find.
I don't think I could do that. I really admire and envy the people who are able to maintain this median status quo, and as you say, this kind of zen-like state. I don't think that's within me to do it. It's certainly not within the kind of new life that I've chosen for myself. I don't think I'd be able to work that in. But God, kudos to anybody that can.
It's balance and it's challenge, isn't it? So how important has social media and Twitter particularly been for you in terms of coming to terms with chronic illness and having an outlet to the world? Was that quite an important part for you in terms of
when I first joined Twitter during lockdown, one of my reasons for joining actually was, well, I was tired of watching the news because everything was about COVID. But B, I thought that maybe I could connect with people who have ME and not necessarily be talking individually to them, but just be looking at some of the conversations, So I started looking at some of the hashtags. That's probably how you and I got following each other, because I, followed a thread somewhere along the line. And it did become important. However, what I did find was that I would post a couple of things up, just replying to a thread about ME, and people would come on and be incredibly mean. And I've never really understood the need for that. So, and only recently, I don't know where this person came from, but I put something up. I'd been doing something on Channel 5, and somebody posted up, a victim of romance fraud. He obviously hadn't watched it because I'm not a victim of romance fraud. I was just talking about it. But he said, a victim of romance fraud and a victim of ME. how awful, and then put this link to some website debunking Emmy, and I thought, okay, I'm just going to ignore you. But then a few people who obviously follow me and maybe have Emmy themselves sort of jumped on him and said, well, what about this? What about this? And I kept going on and saying, please just ignore this person because he's looking to be upsetting. And he was posting all this stuff about, laziness and, get off your ass and get a job, get down the gym. So although social media has been wonderful for me in terms of my new life is based around social media, there's also this really horrible side to it where people are just determined to upset somebody. That seems to be what they wake up in the morning and want to do. And,
Yeah.
you and I were saying before we started recording this that sometimes the problem with the condition is that you just don't have the energy to fight the people that are having a go at you. So
Yeah.
you end up just giving in. You used the phrase earlier, choose your battles, and that's exactly how it is. When I looked at this person, I thought, I could talk to you for 10 years about this and you would still choose to be nasty. So I'm just going to leave it.
It's hard because I think for me, Twitter became kind of my place in terms of like talking about chronic illness, sharing things, I used to write blogs a lot more. But it's kind of gone downhill a lot the last couple of years, particularly in terms of the stuff that you're seeing that you just don't want to see, or that you kind of not. It's like, how has this come on my feed, sort of thing, because it's somebody that it's sort of like a distant connection somehow that's then kind of put it in your face, and then you're sort of unfollowing people that might have shared that kind of content, and it's difficult, but it's trying to kind of like use it almost in a way that you sort of still maintain that community without trying to see the other stuff. So I tend to just follow a bunch of people and then just see what those people have sort of posted, rather than kind of just trawling through kind of the feed and things like it. But it's hard to maintain that community sort of feel without, and I'm not sure you can find it elsewhere. Like I've sort of joined other kind of platforms, but it's hard to kind of build up that community again, isn't it, from scratch? But
it is, and I think as much as people are leaving Twitter and going to other platforms, I don't think there'll ever be anywhere that's as big as Twitter, because people are leaving and going to different places, so it's never all in one place. But the algorithms on Twitter now, like you say, you can end up seeing things on your feed that you really don't want to. So I occasionally go on. I've been following all the stuff that Lawrence Fox has been doing, because my partner and I have been, well, to be honest, just sort of laughing at this man's crazy existence. Now, as a result, Twitter must have decided that I'm a very right-wing person. So they're now putting loads of really stuff that I don't believe in, putting all these things up on my feed, and I'm having to kind of delete them as I go along. And then I end up, not actually going onto my timeline at all because I'm worried about what I'm going to see. So I don't know the answer to what's happening with Twitter at the moment. I just know that it's a very unpleasant place, and I see a lot of videos that I don't want to see, people being hurt, and videos from what's happening over in Gaza and stuff, and it's quite an upsetting place.
So do you want to tell us a bit about how the book came about, because that was kind of off the back of sort of experiences with Twitter, wasn't it? And do you want to tell us a little bit about the book and how that sort of like developed, really, and it'd be interesting to learn.
So when I joined Twitter, I went on, I made a profile. It just said that I had, that I like dogs and scuba diving. It's pretty much all it said in my profile. It might even have mentioned ME, possibly fibromyalgia. And amongst all the, in inverted commas, normal people that followed me, I had suddenly an influx of very young, handsome men that decided to tell me that I was the best thing ever in my Twitter inbox. And it became apparent that romance fraud is a very, very, very big thing, mainly starting on social media and then moving on to other platforms, and also dating sites. And I spent time Well, I spent time wasting their time. That's kind of how it started. Putting the responses up on Twitter, and my following grew because people were finding it funny. Then an unintended consequence is that people started messaging me saying, I have been a victim of romance fraud. And I started talking to people during lockdown. At the time, I still didn't really know anything about romance fraud. But I was talking to people and just being a bit of a sounding board, because it became clear that not many people actually confide in their family and friends if they've been a victim. And the more that I was talking to people, the more it became apparent that it's an absolutely massive subject with very far-reaching consequences. And I'd sort of inadvertently drawn a lot of attention to it by being funny. And it turned out to be an incredibly positive thing. Using my form of humour, which of course not everybody will like, but using my form of humour to address some of, I guess, some of what is a really horrible thing happening in society these days. And it's been a really positive experience, and I've got a lot from it. And, a lot of people who have messaged me have got a lot through it as well. And since the book came out, in fact, only this morning, I had a message through Instagram from somebody who said that they've read the book and they've finished a relationship that they were in as a result of it.
Wow.
Because they now believe it to be a fraudulent one because they'd sent money. So all round, it's been a positive experience. Tiring.
Yeah. Because it's I read the book a few weeks ago, and I've sort of talked on the podcast before about how I haven't, especially the last 2 or 3 years, haven't read much at all. Like if I do sort of consume stuff, it's like audiobooks and things like that, and sort of non-fiction stuff that you can just dip in and out of. But I just loved your writing style and the way that you did a sort of approach it, because it made it easy to read, but it was also just really funny, and it didn't feel like a slog reading it. It was just something that was kind of enjoyable, but also really enlightening as well. Like something that I wouldn't necessarily have sort of picked up and thought, if I was in a bookshop, I wouldn't have necessarily thought, oh, I'll read that. But actually, having read it, I really enjoyed it and learned a lot. And I think you get that balance really well between the initial kind of stages of the book, which are just like, oh, this is just really daft, and you're getting messaged by like dozens of Keanu Reeves or different actors or whatever, and how that kind of like looks and how it comes across, and particularly the language that's used with people that are contacting you, that it's almost like the grasp of English is just not quite there, but they're sort of like saying the things that they think should be said to somebody to kind of like, and it is really fun, and some of it is really funny, but then you sort of like, as the book goes on, you sort of like, it hits you then actually the reality of the situation, how people are drawn in to sort of like what they think is a relationship. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that, and how that's kind of, people are kind of like, it's playing on emotions, isn't it? A lot of it somehow.
Yeah. So something that I talk about in the book is that there's a big similarity between what victims of romance fraud go through and victims of domestic abuse. Not the violence, but the domestic abuse side of it, because at the centre of both of those things is coercive control. And I was in a abusive relationship years ago. And when I was talking to victims of romance fraud, I kept thinking to myself, hang on, that's what he used to say to me, or that's what I used to then go and do. And then I started to speak to criminologists, very clever people, and they'd said exactly the same thing. So there's this, when somebody makes you feel like you are really special, really loved, they automatically have a little bit of a hold on you, whether you've met them in person or not. But coercive control really sort of steps in when they start isolating you from friends and family. They start sort of punishing you with periods of silence. That there's a lot of gaslighting goes on. And whenever I talk about romance fraud, I have a lot of people say, well, surely you've got to be stupid to fall for that. I mean, you'll know, having read the book, that I hate the term fall for. But the people that I spoke to were clever, articulate, attractive. They had a good circle of friends. And it's people on the outside, when I was in an abusive relationship, they wouldn't have seen me as stupid or a victim. They wouldn't have known. It's only when you come out of it and you look back and you think, oh, this is what happened. So it's a fascinating subject, a really fascinating subject. And no matter what anybody says, we are all susceptible to coercive control in some form or another.
Yeah. It's yeah, and I didn't know an awful lot about the sort of the scamming side of it. But like even like a couple of years ago, I think I was contacted on WhatsApp by a woman who claimed to be in the American army in Afghanistan, and it was only like and she was. But what was really strange is wanting to know if I could help her find a copy of this book. And it was a really random book, and I googled the book, and the book didn't exist. And she said, "Oh, that's because it's like it's a US Army publication or something like that." Well, I'm just a random. So I was just a bit like you, just bored, really. Like I was, I was just kind of, and I wasn't, I wasn't being duped. But as soon as I kind of started, and it was as simple as just googling like about scams and people in Afghanistan or whatever or wherever they claim to be, and like, but she was even sending me like pictures of supposedly like equipment that she was using to communicate with and things like this, and then you start and learn. So like it was pretty soon that I kind of realized that this was just some sort of, and I was kind of like almost like waiting. I was kind of just randomly sort of like I was a bit bored by this point, and I was just kind of like the conversation kept going, a bit like your sort of, but a bit like the sort of with you, and I was kind of waiting for them to somehow, and I even told them about online scams once I kind of googled and read about them and stuff, and people can, and it was just interesting, but yeah, it just kind of died off, but I was just it was just like wow, yeah, like because I can see how people could be sort of drawn into these sort of things quite easily and quite quickly, without even kind of really being sort of taking the sort of time to step back and things.
Yeah, and during COVID, it was, the number of romance fraud cases shot up unbelievably because, of course, there were a lot of people who were bored. They were at home on their own, and you're much more if you get a message through Twitter, you're much more likely to answer that message if you've been at home for ages and you're just scrolling, you're watching TV. You're much more likely to answer it than you are if you're in the middle of a busy day at work. So during COVID, so many people got talking to people that they didn't know in person. And, sometimes it worked out well. There was a lot of sort of online date, people did video dates and stuff through COVID, but the romance fraud side of it, they were incredibly successful during that period. Because not everybody who becomes a victim of a romance fraud is lonely and isolated, but there is that section. And during COVID, that felt worse than anyone. I mean, I was living with my mum during COVID, and even I felt lonely and isolated, and there was another person in the house there with me. So you can see how it might be, particularly for somebody older, perhaps, who doesn't get out as much anyway and lives on their own. But these fraudsters, they're everywhere. So like you say, you got contacted on WhatsApp. I mean, how they got your number?
I don't know. Yeah, it was just like, and I think because it's WhatsApp, like if that was a Twitter thing, I would just have ignored it. But it was WhatsApp, and it was the initial sort of like, oh, do you know where I can find this book? And I'm just like, oh, no. And then it was just a conversation. It wasn't like I wasn't interested in anything sort of like, I mean, I'm happily married and stuff like that. So I was just like, it was more just a sort of like random like sort of WhatsApp thing. And I was like, oh, that's because I don't think I ever get sort of random messages on WhatsApp. It's just not something that happens with on my phone.
No.
So yeah, like you say, it was just very strange. And I thought, do I know this person or whatever? And yeah, it kind of
because it's a more weird interaction platform, I think. WhatsApp, it tends to be people who've got your number. But you even go on to, there's some online word games that you can play. There's It's one called Words with Friends, and it's like Scrabble, basically. But I went on there and I had to come off, because every time you start to play somebody new, you get a message, "Hello, dear." You think, "Oh, you're joking." And it ends up that probably only 1 out of 5 people that you play is actually a person who wants to play this game. The rest of them are people who want to get you off that platform and start ultimately asking for money. It's
Yeah.
incredibly frustrating.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you sort of like, it's almost like you sort of fell into this kind of like this world, and you became interested in it, and it was an outlet for you, I suppose, to sort of like become interested in something that was beyond, kind of just the drudgery of living with ME or whatever. But how was the process of writing the book for you, and how did you manage the demands of the research and the writing? Because it's quite obvious when reading the book that you did an awful lot of research, and like you literally went and visited people and things like that. So it wasn't just kind of like sat in your house. You kind of went out and about, didn't you? And how was that process for you, living with your ME and then managing all that? It sounds like it must have been quite a sort of balancing act.
Yeah, the tough doesn't describe it. Worth it. But so normally, I guess, again, in inverted commas, a normal person, if they were doing an interview 2 hours away, you might drive 2 hours, speak to somebody for a couple of hours, and then drive back. But that's absolutely impossible for me to do. So I was saving up money, driving somewhere, having to spend a night or 2 nights in a hotel and then drive back. So there was a lot of that kind of thing. I was lucky in that I was able to do a lot of research on my laptop from my bed. But as you'll know, there are times when, even when you're lying in bed, you can't bring yourself to even consider turning a laptop on and Googling
No,
stuff, because nothing would go in. Absolutely nothing.
no.
So very much in the same vein as I was saying about how I find it hard to pace, I was going through stages where I'd have a day where I would sit and research and make notes and make phone calls. And then I'd have 3 days where I did nothing. And actually it worked for me. It was one of those situations where I mentioned, you consider the payoff. So I would think, right, how important is this interview? Okay, I'll get 3 done in a day, and then I can have 2 or 3 days off. And it was hard. And there were times when I thought that I would never get through it. I was lucky in that I didn't have a very, very, very strict deadline, because I was very clear with the publisher that, I have this condition and I can't always do things when I need to. But I did make the deadline that we set between us. But it was tough. And I remember there being times when I was sitting exactly here and typing, and my hands would seize up. One of the issues I get with my ME is that my hands kind of seize like claws, and they become sometimes so painful that I can't open the packets of painkillers. So there were times I was typing and I would just sit and cry, and it was so horrendous. But again, all I kept thinking is, this is temporary, it'll go, and then you can rest. So it was tough, but I wouldn't have changed it. I wouldn't not have done it. And I did it in the only way that I could, with absolutely no pacing.
And with it, just with it's like that kind of like perseverance, sort of like and just taking it a step at a time, isn't it? I think so.
Yeah, and also writing the book was quite cathartic for me, because I talk in there about my own mental health. I don't talk about ME. I don't think I even mentioned ME in there, but I talk about my own mental health, and I think my mental health has always played a big part in my ME journey. And since things have got better mental health wise, I found it easier that my ME hasn't got any better, but I have found it easier to process what needs to be done to live with it. So that's also helped.
Yeah,
If that makes sense.
no, it's it is hard, isn't it? And I think finding things to do with when you're living with ME and chronic illness and finding a focus. Like for me, I found that since I started this podcast with my friend, with my mental health's improved in just in having that sort of like a focus and an outlet, because it's hard to sort of find something that you can occupy yourself with, but that you can actually, that is manageable as well, isn't it? And
Yeah, of course.
that's a big challenge, and it's been good, I guess, that you've the channeling into this and seeing the way that it's helped other people must be really encouraging for you, with the book particularly.
Yeah, it is. And there were quite a few years where I thought that I was living on the outside of society. You know, everyone was kind of living their lives, and I was there, and I was, in my friends' lives, but never really living anything myself. It was an existence rather than a life. So doing this, writing the book, and doing kind of the media around it, and particularly hearing how it's been enjoyed by people, but also helped people, it has really meant that things have been worth it.
Mm.
And it's a terribly cliche thing to say, and I always kind of cringe when I hear other people say this, but everything that's happened with the book, and being able to feel better about things, it has almost made those several years of hell, it has almost made that worth it, because I wonder if, had I not lived through that period, whether I'd have been able to do this. It's made me more of an empathetic person, certainly,
Mm.
and it's given me a more well-rounded view of life in some way. I'm able
Mm.
to consider things a lot more slowly, probably because my brain works a lot more slowly these days. So it's become part of what makes me me.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, I get that, and yeah, um, I had ME for like 6 7 years as a teenager, and I definitely feel like that kind of like, it's funny. It's funny. Like after I recovered for 20 years, and then I sort of always look, when I was, after I'd recovered, I always look back and thought, oh, I wouldn't change what happened. But now I'm like, now I'm not sure kind of thing, because I think actually it stole so much of me. But it's a balance, isn't it? Because you do learn an awful lot about yourself, and you're able to reflect more, aren't you? Because of, and I think those of us with chronic illness we do see the world differently, and it's a unique insight, isn't it? It's not
Yeah,
always easy, but
certainly.
it does give you a different sense of empathy and things like that, doesn't it? Maybe,
Yeah. I
possibly.
mean, on the sort of downside, I think it's made me more of a frustrated person as well.
Mm-hmm.
When there are times when family and friends, they'll say, "Oh God, this is happening in my life, and this is so terrible. It's the worst thing to ever happen to anyone." And I think, is it? So
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
sometimes, so I am more empathetic, but I tend to, I tend to also be more frustrated
yeah,
when I see people battling what they consider are
yeah,
huge issues.
yeah,
Whereas in actual fact, I don't know, they haven't got a remote for their TV, and they've got to go to the supermarket, and actually they
yeah,
really don't want to. And I think, oh, just, or they've got a headache.
yeah.
Oh, have you?
Or they've been off work for 2 weeks or something, ill with a bug or something, and then
Yeah,
they go back to work, and
exactly,
it's like,
exactly. I had a
yeah,
friend the other day took 3 days off with a cold, and said, "Oh, this is ruining my attendance record. It's really good, the whole 3 days." And I said, "Oh, it's okay. It doesn't matter." And inside, I was thinking, "What?"
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's different, yeah, different levels of sort of priority, isn't it? Yeah.
But
So
then you have to remember that, I have to remember that's what I was like
yeah,
pre-ME.
yeah, yeah. It's we see the world differently, don't we? In
Yeah,
terms of what is. terrible, yeah, or levels of kind of like, yeah, disaster, yeah, yeah. I was, I always remember, I was a social worker, and I went to visit. I was new into a job, and there was an older social worker, an older fella, a bloke, and I think he retired actually not long after I started. But he talked about everybody's got like a bullshit quota sort of thing, and you know, and we talked about different foster carers. Some foster carers would just be able to deal with kind of like the most incredible amount of pressure ever, and they'd just be sort of like, oh well, you know, and other foster carers. I'm not sort of focusing on foster carers here, but it's life, isn't it? That others would, you know, the smallest thing would happen, and it would just be the most dramatic thing ever, sort of thing, and it would be,
Yeah.
and you said different people got different quotas for sort of managing sort of
Yeah.
different levels of, yeah,
And, you know, as you'll know, your ability to manage these things, it goes up and down depending on how well you're feeling that day.
definitely,
So if I'm having a terrible day and I can barely lift my head off the pillow, and a friend sends me a message and says, oh, I'm really annoyed, I've got to go to a meeting I don't want to, then I'm more likely to put the phone down and think I'll respond to that later.
mm,
Just because I think I can't deal with that. But you know, it's like you say, we have a completely different insight
mm,
into life, I think. And I don't know, maybe we appreciate good times a bit more. I'm not sure.
because they are so, yeah, few and far between, yeah, and
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly aware that the last few months that I've been doing kind of media stuff, and I've really been enjoying it. I'm very aware that I'm having these good times because it feels so special,
mm,
and that's nice. You know, I'm not sure whether I would feel the same if I was just able to do it all day, every day. I don't know if it would have the same meaning.
yeah, it's interesting, like, and when you do have the energy to do something, like I've kind of very cautiously booked some tickets to see David Gray talking about curlews. It's a very strange event next month. He's into birds, the music artist David Gray, and he sort of plays, you know, to thousands of people in arenas and stuff. And he's doing a very small event in one of our local towns, talking about curlews. But he's also going to be doing some music, and I haven't been able to go to live music for a very long time, like since, well, it's 6.5 years since I became ill, because I just can't deal with the sort of environment and things like
Yeah,
that. Just
yeah.
being in anywhere where there's lots of people and busyness, and then obviously we had COVID and all that. But I haven't been in that sort of environment. And I thought, do you know what I mean? I've had a slightly better couple of weeks, and then you do sort of, you think, oh, I can do more now, which isn't necessarily true. So whether I get to this event or not, and what curlews are one of my favourite birds because we have them on the farm here where I live. So I thought, yeah, one of my favourite birds and one of my favourite music artists. Yeah,
What a
strange.
weird coincidence.
Yeah, strange because I thought I'd just love to do that. So I booked tickets for my parents and myself, and I'm thinking, if I do manage to go to that event, it'll be like I'll live off that event for like months afterwards because
Yeah.
I know that there won't be anything else that I'll, you know, or like my wife and I went for a night away like about 8 weeks ago, and it still feels about like 2 weeks ago. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
it was something that was really nice and special, and we had a nice time, and it was like time. You sense the time gets warped, doesn't it, when you're living with Emmy, and you know,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah,
I've it's my partner's birthday at the end of this month, and I've bought him 2 tickets to see Noel Gallagher
mm,
at Warwick Castle near me. And I've never been a fan of live music particularly anyway, even when I was well. But I've bought these 2 tickets, and I'm going to try and go. But there's a thing on the ticket that says if you have any form of disability, you can be in a separate area. So when I
mm,
give him the tickets, it's this silly thing. He knows me. He helps me when I need things, but I'm going to feel bad saying to him, is it okay if we're away from the main bit so that I can sit down?
mm,
Because, you know, loud things, I have my TV really quiet. I always have my music quite quiet. So it's going to be a struggle for me to start with. But I feel bad that I'm going to have to ask him to kind of segregate, and to come and sit down in a special section with me. And so then part of me thinks, I should just give him the tickets and get him to go with someone else. It's little decisions like that I think most people don't have to deal with. They would just think, oh, great, tickets to go and see somebody my partner likes, brilliant. But there's this sort of little bit at play where, and also there's this horrible part of me, it's not good to say this out loud, it's not good to publicly admit it, but there's a horrible part of me that thinks, I don't want to be segregated. I don't want to go and sit with a load of other people who probably don't want to be sitting with me either. It feels like you're going to go and sit with a load of misfits and none of us want to be in that section, but none of us have a choice. There's still so many years later. I mean, I think it's about 12 years since I got poorly. Still, 12 years later, there are things like that to think about.
Yeah. It's hard, isn't it?
Yeah.
In terms of the book, I mean, it was. We've sort of gone down rabbit warrens, haven't we? But it's been interesting. But you sort of, there's some really dark themes that come up, isn't there? Was that quite sort of like disturbing to you to discover, kind of as the book goes on? There's some sort of really stuff because you talk about West Africa and a lot of the scams that happen. In a lot of the scamming comes from that part of the world, or Southeast Asia, and then there's sort of issues around voodoo and sort of rituals and things like that. Was that quite a shock that you started off writing the book from one perspective and then it kind of delved into something else?
Yeah. So speaking earlier about not being right wing, when I first started this, I thought, right, I'm going to dispel these myths that these people say, oh, these bloody Nigerians, I'm going to dispel this myth. But I couldn't, because unfortunately, Nigeria and Ghana are still responsible for a large portion of romance fraud. And Southeast Asia has overtaken even them. But the romance fraud coming from Southeast Asia involves a lot of human trafficking, and some people are being forced to scam. And as you say, over in the west coast of Africa, there is still a belief in some areas in voodoo. So these young lads, they call themselves Yahoo boys in Nigeria. They will go to a magic man, a juju man, and ask him to make them a better scammer. And some of the things that I was reading, about kidnappings and human organs being harvested, there was a point when I kept rereading these things in Nigerian newspapers and thinking, well, this can't be true. I kept having to recheck my facts. And it is true. And there was a time when I thought, right, do you know what? I've got what I need for the book. I'm going to stop looking now. Because some of what you come across, when you go down these rabbit holes, and you could look forever, you could read and you could watch videos, and it could just be forever. There was a point when I thought, no, stop this now. You've got what you need. And some of this is so unpleasant that I'm done here. I'm done with this bit.
Yeah. And I think you found a nice balance in terms of addressing the things. Well, not nice is the wrong word, but an effective balance in terms of like addressing some of the things and actually raising awareness about some of those issues. Because I was just like, man, I had no idea. You sort of know about the sort of the scamming and stuff like that, but the level that what's behind it, and obviously with the almost like people are being forced to do the scamming, or it was incredible, really. It's thank you for writing the book. It's fascinating. One of the things that made me made me think a little bit was, in the book you challenge notions of what it means to be vulnerable and people's perceptions of those who are deceived and falling in love with a fraudster. And you challenge this sort of idea of people falling for a scam, and also the sense of people thinking, oh well, that would never happen to me. I wouldn't fall for that. I wouldn't kind of get sort of caught up in that sort of thing. and I was wondering whether you feel there's maybe like similarities with people's internal belief systems relating to that sort of thing, and then also with like ME and long COVID and chronic illness, the similar sort of thing in terms of that wouldn't happen to me. Do you think there's sort of like this sort of similar sort of thing going on there in terms of like when we do talk to people who don't have an understanding of our condition, and a lot of this stuff that we talked about earlier about Twitter and online stuff. Do you think there's this sense of, well, I wouldn't get ill, that wouldn't happen to me, therefore there's a sense of responsibility for people that are, upon people that are ill because they brought it on themselves, or that sort of thing? Is I just thought it was interesting that there's maybe a parallel there.
Yeah, and funny enough, as I was writing it, I had the exact same thoughts.
That's interesting.
And there's still embarrassment and shame around ME, which of course there shouldn't be. The same as romance fraud, there shouldn't be an embarrassment and shame around it, because it's something that happens to you. You don't just walk into either of those things. But you know, I shared with you this morning that I had a plumber here this morning, and I'd been sitting at my desk, and I thought, no, I've got to lie down. So I got on the sofa under a blanket. He said to me, "Oh, you're just going to sit around watching telly all day, are you?" And then when I said about having ME, he said, "Oh, is that just when you sit around on your ass?" And I felt embarrassed, even though I shouldn't. Of course, I shouldn't feel embarrassed, but I didn't have the energy to argue with him. And I think there is this similarity with the romance fraud thing. People think it'll never be me. And I know even among family and friends, I think there is this idea that I could do more. If I really put my mind to it, I could do more. I'm letting this illness beat me. So I don't really talk about it. And I think that's what happens with romance fraud as well. Family and friends think, well, you know, you could have acted differently there. You could have done something differently there. So people don't share. And just like those of us with a chronic illness do, you become slightly more isolated because you don't want to share these personal things, because people don't understand, because it hasn't happened to them and they think that it never would. They believe that they're somehow stronger, they're somehow more physically and mentally capable. And you end up feeling lonely. You can be in a room full of people and you feel very lonely. And I think everybody with a chronic illness will, you know, that will resonate to some extent or another. And the victims that I spoke to for the book, there's nothing physical about what they went through, but the effects are embarrassment, loneliness, not having the energy to, in their case, the emotional energy to fight this, because people's perceptions are so, well, wrong. They're wrong. So it's interesting that you picked up on that. You know, the podcasts that I've been doing, they've been either with kind of comedians or with crime experts. So there's been there's been no way of bringing illness into it. So it's interesting that you did pick up on that. And I'm really glad that you picked up on that, because it kind of validates what I was thinking as well.
That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I was like, am I stepping too far in terms of making that connection? But I think it's, yeah. And yeah, particularly reading your book, and you do feel, particularly for the people that are victims, that shame that must be huge, and not wanting to, like, I think there was one case where there was like a woman who'd literally sort of like, you know, kind of given away her entire sort of like life savings, and then worrying about the impact on, you know, when her children found out afterwards that there was no inheritance and stuff like that. And you just think, oh, you know, it really kind of grabs you there, doesn't it, in terms of like the very real impact on people of this sort of fraud, and having to kind of keep that silent because they don't want to deal with it, and it's sort of bigger and bigger hole, isn't it? And
And I'll tell you what
hard.
else is, and only just thinking about it now, another similarity between the people who've undergone that and people with a chronic illness, and I'm thinking particularly ME here, is that there's nowhere to go. There's nowhere to go for support. There are online groups which you can go to, but generally, in my experience, GPs haven't been great. If I go, I've got other health problems, and if I go to A&E, for example, for my other health problems, I've stopped when they say what else is wrong with you. I've stopped mentioning ME because they always cross that off. And I'm lucky in that I'm under the care of a CFS clinic now. Nothing happens, but it's nice to be under the care. But I think, again, when you're the victim of a misunderstood crime, you feel there's nowhere to go there either. And when you do speak to people, it's misunderstood. So you then, that's an interesting one as well, actually, that maybe that's, I've because of various things that have happened in my life, I've found these victims sharing their stories with me, I found that I've been able to appreciate and empathise with what they're saying a lot. And I think it's because of all these various things. And sometimes I haven't really put two and two together, but maybe that's another part of it, that feeling of there's nowhere to go. Who do I speak to about this? Who can help me? Oh, no one.
Yeah.
And that feeling of despair that you've got to deal with this on your own.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, yeah, that's probably a good place to finish. But it's been really good to talk, and it's been, like I say, I really enjoyed the book. It's if people are looking for something to read that's a bit different, it's not about ME at all. It's not about chronic illness, but it's very enlightening. And yeah, it's Keanu Reeves is not in love with you. Just in case you thought he was, and
it
yeah,
is on Audible now as well, I'm pleased to say.
I was going to say, yeah. So where's the best place to get it if people wanted to? I mean, obviously Audible's probably the place for the audiobook. Is it just Amazon, or is there somewhere else that's better for you in terms of purchasing the book?
I mean, wherever's easiest for other people, I guess. I mean, it's cheapest on Amazon. I think it's about £9.55. You can get it in Waterstones, independent bookshops, pretty much anywhere now, which is really good. And in terms of the audiobook, obviously Audible, but it's also on the other places. I'm not very good with audiobooks, so I don't know, but it's on all of them.
Yeah. And what's next? Because you're writing again, is that right? You're sort of looking at something else, or?
Yeah, so sometimes I think, what am I doing? So I'm writing a proposal for a second book. So there is no second book being written, but the proposal is pretty much done. And it's going to be, again, about unsavoury people on the internet, but this time about men who send women pictures of their bits that women really don't want to see. So, because it's a much bigger subject than you might think. I've been looking into the psychology of it. I've been interviewing a couple of people. So one who used to go out flashing in the street, for example, looking at why it's done, the impact that it has on women, why it's changing how young people interact. It's quite a big subject. It's genuinely quite interesting. And anybody that follows me on Twitter will know that I have a constant battle with a man called Greg, who's always sending me pictures that I don't want to see. So Greg will feature, if the book becomes a book, Greg will feature quite heavily.
Yeah. And I think even in this book, it's I love the fact that you've included sort of like screenshots of some of the conversations and stuff, and that just adds to that, breaks up the text, but it adds to the humour of it as well. So yeah,
I think it's just a way of being engaging.
Yeah, it's good. So we'll keep an eye out for that as well. So I'll put links to the book in the description, and if people want to look into that. And it's been really good to talk. So thanks so much for your time, Becky. It's been good.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been really good. It's time for a lie down now, but it's been really good
for me as well. So yeah, but thanks for joining us.
All right,
Cheers.
thank you.
Bye.